Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Times are tough. COVID-19 is forcing difficult decisions to be made. The events and communications industry is being hit hard. Now, amazing events that people have poured their hearts and souls into, are being cancelled. Over the next 60 minutes, we're going to help you. The next few months are going to be tricky, but that is no reason why organisations need to stay silent. With the current environment, digital events offer a great route forward. They take effort, but that's when we're here to help you. My name's Jessica McDonald, and I'm a Senior Project Manager at Live Group. So it's my responsibility to manage some of our biggest and most exciting events and new initiatives as well. Now I'm joined here by Toby Lewis, our CEO.
Good morning.
Who has been in the events industry for 25 years and has been moving forward with virtual events for the past 15. Now we're also joined by Bruce Rose, our Head of Content.
Morning, Jess.
And he has been guiding our clients through virtual events for the past 5 years. Now it's his aim to ensure that the digital audience is as engaged as a traditional physical audience. And he tries to do this in the most cohesive way. So from the agenda to content to interactive tools, and of course ensuring that the production is as high a standard as it would be with a traditional event. Now we, like many companies, have taken precautions and are safeguarding our people. And as you can see, we are all separately joining here today from different parts of the UK. So we're going to start by looking at the current situation and how we predict things are going to evolve over the coming months. Now, Toby's going to look at the industry response, and he's going to look at what organisations need to keep in mind from a strategic point of view. Now, Bruce is going to look at our content options, and finally, I'm going to look at logistics and how to plan for a digital event. Then we're going to open up the floor for your burning questions, and we hope to answer as many of them as possible. Now, below this video right now, there is a box. If you have any questions, please drop them in here and you can submit as many as you like. Now, we genuinely believe in the power of digital, and we want to help anybody who's organising an event right now. And that is why we are going to be hosting these webinars every 2 weeks. The next one is going to be on Thursday, the 2nd of April. We're going to have different topics, and this is going to be shaped from the questions that you are submitting. Now, if you have anybody else that you think this will be relevant for, or the information will be useful, please do share it with them. And together, we can get your comms back on track. Now I'm going to hand over to Bruce, who is going to look at the current state of affairs.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Jess, for that introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us here today. I do think it's important to go over this just state of play with what's happening out there. I do appreciate for some of you, you have probably heard some of this information before, but as long as we're all on the same baseline level, I think we can have a more productive conversation. I'll also apologise for the state of my voice. It's a little bit croaky, but hopefully you can still hear me and understand me, and together we'll soldier through. So, COVID-19, it is a nasty virus. It is new. First discovered and reported to the World Health Organization, the WHO, on the 31st of December 2019, and has since then obviously increased exponentially and torn through the planet. Most governments around the world, with a few exceptions, have viewed that containment options have largely failed and that they now need to go on to a delay phase. And by delay, it basically means that they want to ensure that although they accept that new infections will happen, they're going to happen with a time delay sufficient enough to not overload the hospital systems in their countries. That's obviously quite critical with the nature of this virus, where most people are entirely fine. However, certain people, with a predominance towards older age groups, although by no means a certainty, developed quite serious symptoms, which is why the response has been quite drastic. And I will say, in terms of managing a pandemic like this, is that you almost want to have a situation where in a few months people say, well, I'm not sure what all the big deal was about. And that seems like a lot of fuss about nothing. That generally means that containment has been successful and we've avoided a health catastrophe. And so when you're seeing these interventions happening in the wider world, there is a very good reason for that. And that ultimately is about protecting lives. This has obviously had a profound effect on people. Social distancing is now the new normal. People are looking at all elements of travel that they do and are examining them under the microscope of, will this affect my health? Will this actually impact my ability to be healthy, happy, and live a productive life? Now, that has an immediate and quite powerful impact on events. Because most events, people looking at them, most gatherings even, people looking at them and say, it is not worth it. And that is obviously absolutely tragic for this industry, because events that normally would have happened are now immediately being cancelled. And we're seeing that across the globe. There are a few events that are still going ahead, a few major events that are still going ahead. The recent chess Masters tournament in Russia springs to mind, which actually has full isolation for each of the delegates and a complete ground-up response that's been built over many months. But the new normal is event cancellations, because the simple fact of the matter is, at the moment in this current environment, running a physical face-to-face event, a traditional event as we sometimes call it, is impossible to justify. There is no situation where we should say your content, the content that we're sharing with you is so incredible, so impactful that it's worth risking your health to attend, and actually, considering the shape of this pandemic, worth infecting other people about. It's not just about safeguarding each other's health, it's about safeguarding the whole world's health in many ways. And then, quite critically, I'm seeing a lot of talk about, okay, well, it's the next 3 months. And that's when things are going to be worse, is the next 3 months. And the simple fact of the matter is, there is no certainty with when the next safe months will be. No month at the moment is certain to be safe. And I'll explain why that is. And this is perhaps a graph that you've seen, or a little bit of graphic that you've seen replicated on many sites, which is the idea of an infection curve, and this idea of the need to flatten the curve. And you can see on the screen now, there are two potential futures, shall we say. And the one on the left is when there is no control over infections, and infections are just kind of allowed to run their course. And what we see when that happens is a dramatic increase in infections in a very short period of time. And then they peter out, and actually you hit your peak quite early. Now, there may be some in the events industry and some in other industries that say, well, actually, the sooner we reach the peak, brilliant, because then we return to normality. Obviously, that is a kind of horrific decision that's made devoid of the fact that if we hit that peak, the hospitals are overwhelmed and that people will get very sick, and unfortunately we will lose more lives than normal. Now, all the government interventions within the UK and with governments across the world are all about kind of essentially flattening this curve. And so the graph you see on the right-hand side is when we have essentially controls in place to minimize the number of infections that people can pass on. Now, what that means is that although you hit a peak much later, your overall length of infection is longer. And so if the efforts to flatten the curve are successful, that means that we could be actually seeing a lot more number of months being affected, obviously without the same kind of chaos and that an overrun health system may involve. So I know it's quite tempting to think, well, in June, July, everything will be safe, this will be conquered. There's no guarantee of that. And although in the immediate future, where we're looking at these infections rising quite dramatically, my personal view is that we'll see a great degree of push towards entirely digital events. What the sensible thing is going to be for those trailing months is to have a plan of, yes, if we can run the physical event, brilliant, but what if we can't? And what's our actual route forward? And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. I want to talk quickly about phases as well. We're kind of seeing 3 phases with this in terms of how it affects the population at large, and specifically the nature of events. And so, to begin with, when the news was first breaking, what we were looking at was just the simple fact that people's behavior changed. Now, obviously, the biggest example of this would be panic buying of certain toiletries and things like that. obviously, while that was going on, I was still seeing a lot of people within industry saying, well, events can still happen because the government's not banned them yet. And that is a decision that's entirely devoid of the fact that a lot of delegates had already changed their behaviour. They were already looking at the events that they were going to and saying, actually, it's not worth it. And so even though there was no government intervention, a behaviour change had happened. And that marked the kind of early days. Now, what we're shifting into within the UK and in other governments across the world, but predominantly, I guess, with our reference being the UK, I'll use that as the baseline, that we're now moving into a period of government intervention. And so the UK government has said that meeting in pubs should be avoided, and obviously we're mandating the schools being closed. Now, there is yet to be any sort of mandated advice on events, but it may happen in the line. But basically, at a certain point, governments will intervene to prohibit certain physical events and almost force the hand of people that were contemplating a digital event versus running a face-to-face one. And these two phases about behaviour change and government will be the ones that are kind of dominating our thoughts in the next 6 to 12 months. However, there will be a point when this pandemic is behind us, and what we're going to see then is a societal change where people who might not have ordinarily examined their behaviour with the events they attend, even outside of the outbreak of a pandemic, might say, well, do I need to go to this event? Is it absolutely necessary? I think the thing that we're missing a trick with a little bit is understanding that this event has never happened before in modern times. It is entirely unprecedented. And the simple fact is that will have a dramatic repercussion in how we change as a society going forward and the behaviours that we do. And so there will be quite a dramatic societal shift. The nature of it is still unknown, but it will happen. Now, we're hoping that coincides with other global movements, the efforts to combat climate change, and that will then lead to more hybridized events where people that can travel do, people that can't, or people that make a moral or health choice to not have the ability to engage with content in a meaningful way. So I hope that helps. It is just a very quick recap of the current situation and where we're at. And so I'll now hand over to Toby to talk about the industry response and some of the strategic level events.
Thanks, Bruce. Thank you. I think it's quite a reflective time at the moment, and it's safe to say that a number of industries have been taken a little bit by surprise here, and the event industry is no exception. What we've seen very recently are, as Bruce says, a number of events being cancelled. Because people have felt there is no other option, and probably in the short term, that was a good decision. We're now seeing the emergence of a number of tech companies and even non-tech companies that are saying they do webcasting and engagement, and I think as an industry we've got to adapt very, very quickly and understand exactly what these companies are offering us. Because if we are going to use a company that offers webcasting, then we have to ensure that we're using it just like we would an AV company or a venue, as you would for a traditional event. You need to understand every single application, every single way that bit of technology will be used. And then furthermore, you have to start understanding how your speakers will react when they're talking to a camera and not necessarily talking to an audience. It's a very different thing, I can tell you, because I'm doing it right now. I think most importantly, the industry has to reflect on the audience itself and exactly how the audience will feel not coming together. And Bruce was going to go on about this in a minute. I think we can't shy away from the fact that the industry does have a lack of experience at the moment of project managers, of production managers, of producers who really understand how to engage remote audiences in exactly the kind of way that they would if they were at a real event. Now, just quickly, while we go through this period when we have effectively a lockdown. That live group, we've set up a hub, an online hub, where we're looking after our teams who are working remotely, not just doing the work, but it's a social hub. So we're looking after our people and ensuring that the mental health of our own people is kind of good. And we've actually allocated someone to ensure that every day things are being posted. We're hoping that our people will post things back. We may or may not increase that hub to freelancers, but of course they are also people you have to look after. We need to do this as an industry. We are ensuring that all our procedures and processes are in place so we can actually function now and throughout this life cycle of this virus. You're going to need to start looking at your supply chain to ensure that they are doing the same, because this will gradually finish. We will see the light at the end of the tunnel. And as events start to be run again in whichever way they are, probably with a large digital application, you need to make sure you can get people on the ground that are reliable and are not going to infect the small audiences that start coming out towards the kind of near the end of this pandemic. My segue into what Bruce is about to talk about isn't necessarily for the short term. This is for the medium to long term. And this is where we are focusing quite a lot of our attention at the moment. And it's a concept that we are calling a digital twin. Now, this is a concept where I think as an industry, certainly you have to look at every single aspect of a live event. I mean, every single aspect, from processes to people, to engagement, to content, to speakers, locations. You need to consider every single aspect and then produce those and replicate those in a digital twin. And you need to do that now for events that are happening in maybe the end of May, maybe June and July, certainly events that are happening in September, October, November. You can't shirk away from the possibility that the pandemic will either still be in play there or there'll be another peak as and when we get to those months. So you need to have a digital application, and this isn't just a webcast. This isn't just, audience engagement software. This is a wholesale event in the digital world. So you can start bringing things in. If speaker can't come, you start linking him in via video conference. If some audience can't come, you can webcast. You can remote link up to a number of audiences around the country or the world. And we have to be able to adapt our what we would class as live event into a digital format and then release this digital world in conjunction with live events gradually and slowly as we come out this pandemic, but then be prepared for things to happen in the future which are out of our control. I'm not going to go into that too much now because Bruce is going to explain it more clearly. Bruce.
Thank you, Toby. I think that's quite a crucial point to hit on, is that for many, the response has actually just been, okay, this is a point of cancellation or postponement, and not this is a point where I can make a strong strategic response to what's happening in the wider world. And I've actually seen an awful lot of somewhat conflicting information out there about what all kinds of events in the digital space are, and I'm going to bring people up to speed. I'm going to explain the digital twin concept, and then we'll go over to Jess in terms of the logistics and the planning that goes into running one of these things. So very, very simply, what you're seeing on screen now is the stripped down, boiled down, absolutely condensed aspect of any sort of digital intervention, any sort of digital event. At its core, on the left-hand side, we have content creation. It is the point where your speakers are, your remote speakers are, the point of broadcast. It could be in a speaker's home, it could be in a studio, it could be as part of a traditional event. It is the nexus of where that content is happening. Now, all digital events then need to take the point where that content is being generated and put it to a streaming destination. Now, your streaming destination is actually broke up into two parts. You've got the actual technical backend, the what we call the CDN, the Content Delivery Network, and its job is to take that content where it's being generated and spit it out to all your viewers. But also, more critically, is the hosting location for that content. So, for example, if I was running a stream from my home to YouTube, my content creation is happening at my house, and the streaming destination for that is YouTube. And then the audience, the third piece of this puzzle, is then coming to YouTube to watch that content and engaging. Now, all the best virtual events are, and actually the best webcasts are all the activities and planning that happens all around these 3 points. So when it's at the content creation, who are the speakers? Are they prepared? Do they know how to talk to camera? Are there slides built for a video screen which actually might be quite condensed or compressed depending on the user's bandwidth at the other end? Are they comfortable? What do they need to see? Do they need to see how many people are connected, or do they want to be entirely devoid of that? Do they have a lot of experience presenting to an audience, whereas a camera is a cold, harsh thing that doesn't give you any feedback? I, for example, just have to assume that you're all listening intently right now, but I have no real feedback. Then, the streaming destination. What is happening there, and how are people engaging with it? So, in the run-up to a live event, can they go there? If they can go there, what are they engaging with? Are they engaging with content that you're putting out? Or are they actually talking amongst each other? Are we building a community? Or are we saying, for some, actually, we don't want to put anything out until the live session. It's all going to be live and we're very happy with that. And then finally, for the audience, what's their viewing experience like? Obviously, for this event, we've given you the ability to ask us questions, but could we build on more functionality in future to get the most out of it? Could we provide you a chat room so you can talk amongst yourselves? Do we want to provide an opportunity for everyone to connect in over LinkedIn or something like that? We have lots of options, and really they're based around our objectives. And I'll really get back to this objective first planning, hopefully at the end of these slides. But the digital twin concept for us came from a frustration with how people were approaching digital events in the first place, because we were running quite complicated traditional events, face-to-face events. And whenever we broached the topic of adding a digital element or adding a virtual audience or a remote audience, the solution always seemed to come back to be, okay, well, we'll just live stream it. And for our clients, they didn't want to necessarily engage with that process much more. And it's understandable, because a lot of clients, a lot of organizers, a lot of planners, they're always worrying about the risk factors. So, hey, my traditional event, my face-to-face events, has a whole host of risk factors, from delegates arriving to speakers not showing up to catering issues. Obviously, after September 11th, security became quite critical. And when we tried to push a larger streamed approach, for them, they could often just view it as, oh, well, this is just adding far too many more risk factors for me to think about. And you always got the quite classic one is audiences. And, well, if I stream my event, no one will come in person. And so that frustration kind of led us to boil around, well, we know we can build a virtual event just as well as we can build a physical event, but how do we hybridize those two? And so what you can see on screen now is your typical event agenda. Now, I know no event is the same, and this is quite a shorter event that I've built here, but it hopefully gives you a sense of what a traditional event might be. So arrival, registration, an opening session, keynote speaker, your standard coffee break with a bit of networking, some workshops that you can attend to, and a closing address. Now, in the olden days, and certainly the vast majority of live streaming that happened pre-2018, pre-2017, and actually a lot of what people are selling now is really just kind of bolting on a digital aspect to this. And so, okay, here's our event as it stands, and we're not too worried about arrival and registration because it's just a website. People will just click a link and they'll join. But the event opening will stream, and the keynote speakers, well, we'll stream those. Coffee break, well, we'll stream nothing there. We'll just put up a holding graphic. And then, we can't really give them a workshop because those are smaller things and we don't want to get streaming equipment in there. So maybe we'll run an online workshop, although most people actually just cut that element out entirely. And the closing address, well, it's very important that we stream that. Now, a lot of our frustration was, okay, well, if these are the physical aspects that are happening, well, that's brilliant. And we are bridging them to a wider audience. And we did have a lot of success, essentially expanding an in-room audience of, say, 200 to an online audience of, say, 2,000. But there was always in the back of our mind a little bit of frustration of how much more we can be doing. And a lot of that, when you come to think of it in the virtual event space, is in regards to how we treat the event as a whole and its hosting location. And so we can begin to think of it as a much wider set. And so this column on the left talks about what we can do in terms of the actual virtual event as it exists on a hosting platform. And so, okay, the arrival registration of the typical event maybe doesn't apply. But if we're launching this site in advance of the event, we give people the ability to explore content and pieces of interest well in advance of when the live sessions may start. And one of the questions we try to get to our clients whenever we're running these kind of live streams is, what is the value in running this live? Is there a way that you're engaging with the audience in a way that makes the best use of that format? Or are you just having a message that you need to get out there? Because if it's the latter, and if there's no impetus to run everything at the same moment to a mass audience, well, what can we do pre-event to get that content out there in a way that people can digest in their own leisure, that maybe gets them thinking about questions that they're going to ask during a live session? And so we have a whole opportunity for content explanation. And okay, we have an event opening, but what about a website opening? One of the things that I think is quite important to bear in mind is that most audiences have absolutely no frame of reference for what a virtual event is. And if they do have one, the frame of reference they have may be quite damaging because it's from an older time when the tech wasn't as matured as it is right now. Or perhaps it was one of those kind of off-the-shelf solutions that kind of segues people into a very particular way of running the event. And so can we reset people's expectations of what they're going to be getting from a virtual event? Well, let's do a website opening, a video, or something that we can bring in to kind of make it feel a bit more exciting. And okay, we've covered our keynote speaker, and that's going to be streamed out live, and that's going to be lovely. But what about the networking? Now, networking, and I'll be honest with everyone here, networking suffers in the digital environment. It is not as effective. Meeting people face-to-face is still important. We are social creatures. But what exists online is often that second step. So usually if I go to an event, I meet someone, I find them quite interesting, we'll have a brief chat, and then I'll add them on LinkedIn. Well, can we use the websites to build some intelligent networking tools and actually give people some suggestions for the people that may wish to network with? And as opposed to trying to force those conversations, because it's a digital event, we have other options, why can't we just let them connect with each other on LinkedIn, cut out the middleman? And okay, with the 4 workshops, we've maybe lost, or maybe we're doing different options, but actually doing breakouts in a digital environment is relatively easy if you control the hosting environment. So when people register, why don't we have them choose the workshops that they find most interesting? Why don't we get them to engage with different topics and then use that to inform the digital event? Because to go back to one of our first slides, the content creation bit in a virtual environment is entirely malleable, and so we can change things up very quickly. And then finally, let's not think too much about a closing address. Let's think about a closing community, where once this digital event ends, all those recordings still need to be posted somewhere. There are probably still conversations that need to happen. In the case of this event that we're running here today, we're going to continue the conversation through subsequent live events. And hopefully over time, we'll build up a good, big enough content library just to share with everyone. So building a post-event community is a lot easier, but it's still something that a lot of people aren't necessarily wanting to engage with because they view it as more work as opposed to more value. So when you begin to think about this approach and how we've taken what was this purely physical event and how we've added all these little extras on in terms of the digital twin and the virtual event that wraps around it, you begin to see that the value proposition in terms of the content stacks up far more in favor of a digital twin. And it's not just a case of adding more complexity, it's one of adding more content, more value, more utility into the future, and giving you kind of safeguards that you wouldn't ordinarily have. Now, all of this is very good in abstract, and at the end of the day, we know that you can't just kind of do this and say, right, take your checklist and off you go, and your virtual event is done. I think one of my concerns seeing the response from the larger industry is a lot of virtual event providers, and there are a lot out there, and a lot of them are quite good, is that they offer the single package. And although certainly at the moment where people are in a bit of a panic phase and they're worried about just getting their content out there, that package can be very attractive to them. I kind of want to push people back to that traditional event thinking, in that you want flexibility, and no event is the same and no virtual event is the same. But when you force people to use a certain package or a certain platform, you're losing out on a lot of that flexibility, a lot of that customization that requires your objectives to be kept front and center. So that's really, really critical. That's not to dissuade people from using typical virtual event platforms. Like I say, some of them are good and some of them may fit your objectives. But if that's your sole response, well, I think two things will happen. Is one, you'll realize that some of your events just cannot translate into a virtual environment. And two, your audience will get bored of your format because you're never mixing it up. And they're just getting into this, same old typical virtual event mindset. And that shouldn't be the case. But I want to provide some guidance in terms of a content checklist. If you're thinking about digital, you're thinking of live. These are the questions that you need in your mind at all times when you're planning this stuff. So one I've already touched on is, what value am I adding in making this live? Am I having a lot of audience interaction? Am I giving it a sense of immediacy? For some events, am I giving it a sense of exclusivity in that this will be broadcast once and then never seen again? You have to ask yourself, what is the value of running it live? And if you can't answer that in a convincing manner, maybe you should be doing video work. Maybe you should be doing pre-event stuff and post-event stuff that can still be engaging and exciting, but doesn't necessarily need to be done in the live environment. Secondly, how do you get in the minds of your speakers and get them to understand that this event is very different from the events that they've run? And I'll give you one example that's very typical from speakers. Is I've seen so many speakers take the stage, even if it's something as simple as voting, they'll make some sort of reference to, I hope the technology works, or we'll try using this. And that kind of attitude really undermines the event that you're running. And so when you're talking with your speakers, you want them to understand that this digital layer is a real enabler, and that's something that they should be excited and motivated by. And if they don't understand that, are there other speakers that you can get that would help solidify your message? Thirdly, what can I do to encourage my audience? And so I mentioned about the frame of reference for a virtual event. A lot of people don't have one, or the one that they have is quite bad. So how do you motivate people in advance to say, actually, this is going to be different. We're going to be offering you different ways to connect, different ways to engage, that you'll be getting a lot of value from the live sessions, that actually a lot of you are probably, with school closures, certainly in England, stuck at home, and you probably want a way to engage in a meaningful manner. So what messaging can we do pre-event to get people really excited? Then from a content perspective, if we're looking at it in the pure content perspective of your message in a digital view, what is it that you can get rid of because it's a bit of filler, and what can you emphasize? How do you compress speeches into very quick, easy to digest formats that also then helps with further outreach on social media and things like that? And you need quite a harsh content scalpel to do that, but it is very important. And then finally, and quite critically, we talked about the online audience and an online community. How does this work after the event? Am I doing subsequent ones? Does it die here? Or actually, do I have a content plan? And I would always encourage our clients to have a long tail content plan, because at the end of the day, if your content is interesting enough that you're running an event in the first place, it should still be interesting long after the fact. So if I could get you to remember one thing from this, I hope it's this, is that you're not running an event. A lot of people are looking at it in terms of, I had an event that I was running and now I can no longer run it. Isn't that a shame? I'm just going to translate it digitally. That's not what's happening. What's happening is that you have a set of objectives that you are trying to do, and you want a solution that hits those objectives. And so your mindset in terms of planning needs to be this. Is number one, what am I trying to do? What message am I trying to get out there? How am I wanting to engage with my audience? Number two, what are the barriers that I face to doing that? And so obviously the biggest barrier at the moment in the industry is COVID-19. There's no getting around that. It causes a massive barrier, but digital tools help us overcome those barriers. And then finally, once you know your barriers, you have your objectives, how do I engage with my partners in a way that is really important? How do I get my message to them and get them to understand what I'm trying to do? That if I come to them and say, I'm trying to do this objective, I'm trying to reach it, and they say, well, we can give you a camera and a bit of a streaming package, well then maybe you should find different partners, or maybe you should push them harder to deliver something that's actually going to do what you want to do. And finally, I just want to think about these three possibilities in terms of digital events and how they will change over the coming months. And so I'm just going to cover this quickly and then I'm going to hand back over to Jess. The first is that in the immediate future, I think we're going to see a lot of these remote streamed events where speakers cannot leave their houses. And so we have to do an event much like this one here, where we have 3 speakers in 3 separate locations and we're bridging them together to have a conversation. I think as certain events flex and hopefully we know the shape of this virus and we know the shape of a response, there'll be more opportunities for getting people to studios and doing more stream studio events or more hybridized events. But then as soon as the planning can kick in, we're going to push to more virtual stuff, and that will be kind of the future. And going forward, I do think either the virtual only or the hybridized digital twin will be just the de facto standard. Now, whether that's from a response to this virus, response to sustainability, or just because it gives your audience more options, that's what you need to bear in mind. So I do hope that's useful. I'm now going to hand over to Jess to talk more about the planning and logistics that goes behind an event like this.
Thanks, Bruce. So I'm relatively new to Live Group. I joined the company about 7 months ago, and I have to be honest, when I started, I was skeptical about virtual events. I'd seen them done before, not well, and I was really curious to understand how they could take the place of physical events. So I've more recently ran a full virtual event for one of the big 4 accountancy firms. Now, their drivers were budget constraints and a global audience, but the same rules apply here. And I have to admit, I am now converted. So whether you're organising a full virtual event or a digital twin, your planning approach may vary. So like any event, you start with a kickoff. You bring people together if you can, if you can't, under the given circumstances, and you are, say, having a conversation over video, you want to map out the objectives and the content. Then you want to look at timelines and deadlines. And then you want to look at the functionalities of the registration website. Now, when looking at the agenda for a digital twin, and I know Bruce has kind of touched on this, time allowances that you otherwise would have allocated for the likes of delegate movements at a physical event now need to be taken into consideration for your digital audience. So as Bruce said, you need to make sure that if there is a break, which can also be the case with lunch, tea and coffee, that your digital audience is still engaged so they don't feel secondary. Like a physical event, you may also want to have different audiences seeing different content. Now, that's still possible. During the registration process, we can force them down different routes so that they can see this different content, a bit like at a workshop. Like a standard registration site where you've got a homepage, an agenda, a speaker page, FAQs, contact us, you can now also have things like a content library, a Q&A. You can also have the kind of new element of gamification. Now, this rewards delegates for participating and getting actively involved in the digital event. And then their points get added to a leaderboard. So basically, delegates don't just need to drop in on the delivery days. They can be actively involved for the duration of the event lifecycle. So you can be adding questions and answers, you can be uploading videos and links. Now, we understand that for most organisers, keeping control is really important. So if you are using an event provider, make sure that you're challenging them and you're asking them what they can offer you. I do expect that over the coming months, most events are going to have short lead times. So as I mentioned before, just make sure you've got regular check-ins, whether that's, ideally over video chats, if that's not possible. Just make sure there's regular emails so everybody feels like they're kept in the loop. Now, my top tips for running an event in a digital format would be, don't get overwhelmed. It's so easy, and I have to admit that I was one of them, to understand and to think that a digital event is so different to a physical event. Stop, breathe, don't make any crisis decisions. If you do have an event partner, it is their responsibility to be moving forward with your logistics so that you can still focus on the content and the objectives. Secondly, review timelines and deadlines. These are really similar in logistics. We're going to be launching a registration site. We're going to be uploading and releasing content, sending digital comms, managing a registration site and an inbox, and quite importantly, managing delegate expectations. Make sure they understand what's going to be needed from them, but also what it's all about. And thirdly, prepare for the new environment that you're going to be working in. Whether that is ensuring your speakers are confident in front of a camera, having rehearsal days, training, briefing, potentially hiring your studio space, not just for your rig, but also so that people can really familiarize themselves with the space, maybe get some refreshments in. Basically, make sure everybody feels really comfortable with what they're doing, because it's quite probably going to be really new to them. So essentially what I'm trying to say is digital events are not a world away from your more traditional physical events. And if you haven't already, give them a chance. So I'm now going to hand over to Bruce, who is going to open the floor up for any of your burning questions. Now, just to mention that below me, there is a box. Now, if you have any questions, please add them in there. And as I said before, you can add as many as you like, and we'll try and get through them.
Well, thank you, Jess, and thank you to all of you for watching that part of it and submitting your questions. I have been kind of a gag as everything's come through, because you never know what kind of level of question you're going to get. I'm really excited that people are diving into quite some of the technicalities about this, which is really quite exciting. Some of these would take an entire webinar to answer, but we're going to try and give you snapshots, some quick useful advice, and then we might run a little bit longer to get through a few more questions. We might tackle these as a separate video as well, just for the ones that we don't hit, which is a great example of how a digital event can actually extend where you might not expect it to. But the first question, just because it's come up a lot, is will there be a recording of this? Absolutely. After this broadcast is finished, we're going to get it cut, edited. We're going to put it on our YouTube. We're going to send a link to everyone that's registered. Obviously, it's on YouTube then. It's the easiest way to share it, and then you can share that out as far as you'd want. Burning question, though, outside of that, and it's one probably for you to tackle, Toby, is how much does this all cost?
Thanks for that one, Bruce. I may start this question with a comment, and that might be prior to this virus outbreak. A budget on a traditional event will have been, mainly venue, then a bit of AV, speaker, procurement, facilitators, and then there would have been a bit left for what was classed as digital. So maybe an app. Maybe you want to do a small webcast of a particular workshop. I now think that the format is possibly turned on its head. Right now, you can run a webcast of a speaker for very, very little money. In fact, it's not a difficult setup. I would caution, though, that again, it's all about the engagement of your delegates. It really, the technical setup, which could cost hundreds, a couple of £100, is one thing, but the engagement of your delegates is another thing. We must not go back to the days of WebEx and people listening on a telephone and watching a PowerPoint on their screen. That is not how you engage remote audience. I think as we go through to the latter stages where we're going into the digital twin world, what we're attempting to do currently with our clients is introducing a digital twin in line with the traditional event, as we've said previously. And that digital twin, if a part of it has to be introduced, then we're looking to be able to cancel that part of the event and working with our suppliers and our venues and our speakers in an attempt to mitigate the cost of the cancellation and introduce the digital twin element. And so I would hope that later on down the line, a digital twin doesn't add any cost to what could be a traditional event. But that all depends on the nature and the mix of what you want to do on the digital twin. I think that answers your question.
It does. It just goes slightly against my quick, short, easy answers. So you didn't say £1 million, which is really good. I'll throw over to you, Jess, with the other part of this, which is how quickly can it be done?
Good question. So I guess it depends on what your requirements are. Anything's possible. We've actually had a brief in today, which was formerly a physical event and is now going to become a digital event. And we're going to be delivering that next Wednesday.
Perfect. So very quickly, if it's relatively simple, obviously larger format things take a little bit longer to plan. And I guess from my perspective as a content person, I like a bit of time just to understand what a client's actually trying to do and rebuild stuff as necessary. But I guess crisis comes, you get it out quickly and we can do that, and then otherwise, well, then we're building something up from the ground up. Just tackling a few themes of questions, because a few questions have come in around like, hey, can I have a demo of one of these sites? Can you give a few examples of X, Y, and Z? Do you have any recordings that we can view? Absolutely. We do have a few case studies on our website that go into some of these in a bit more detail. What I would say, though, is obviously with commercial agreements have in place, it's not something we would necessarily just put out there publicly. We can organise private demos to take you through some of this in a bit more detail. And our account team is headed up by Marcus. We're more than happy to do that, I'm sure. So if that is of interest to you, I'm sure we're getting in touch with you after this event anyway with the recording. And you can just reply back saying, hey, I'd really like to demo some of this stuff. And I can happily walk you through some of those as well. A question about gamification, which has come up, which is like, hey, this is a really interesting thing that you mentioned. Can you give some examples of how that might work? So one of the recent events we've done, we basically looked at it in terms of, and this is in cooperation with the client here, I'm not saying we should take all credit, but they wanted to ensure that every action on the site garnered points, and that would basically encourage people to come back to the site more and more. And so everything from logging in to viewing videos to taking part in forums and sharing discussions, that had a points value assigned to it. They were tabulated in a leaderboard, which was visible for everyone to see. And then they were then surplused by interactions that happened in the live stream. So if you watched the live stream, you got points. If you took part in any of the questions that were asked during the live stream, you got more points. Now, one of the things we did for this was that we didn't make visible what activity earned you points and what points you got. So there was just a sense of, hey, the more I do here, the more points I get. Now, that's going to depend on your audience. Hyper-competitive audiences this suits. Others less competitive ones and a bit more kind of teamwork environments, you probably want to have more team-orientated gamification as opposed to individual ones. But it can be done and it can be built to kind of whatever flexibility you want. Toby, I'm going to throw to you for this next one. Is there a role for a facilitator in a digital event, or is this one of the areas that you might cut?
Yes. The short answer is yes. And the number of events that we've run in the digital world and the hybrid events where we've got a real audience and a digital audience, the timing of those must be absolutely perfect, but also the nature of the content and keeping people to time. Speakers can't go on and on as they often do. A good facilitator must be able to be engaging the audience right in front of them as well as the audience watching online. So yes, you must have a good facilitator.
Perfect. You got that nice and short and sweet anyway. That's what I like to see. One for you, Jess. Can any event be a virtual event?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as I said before, just looking at the requirements, what it is that you're hoping to achieve, and then we can definitely turn that into a virtual kind of platform.
I think that the thing I'd add on this is that it's not that any event can become a virtual event, it's that any objective can be translated into a virtual event. One of the briefs we've had recently is, hey, we have an awards ceremony. We can't bring people together anymore. How do we make that digital? And you have to then boil it down into, well, you're trying to reward and recognize people, and how can you reimagine that objective into a better solution? And so that becomes quite critical for us in terms of getting our clients to think outside of the event they were going to try to run, and more about the objectives that they had in mind when that event was first thought of. Another question, which is actually cost difference. So what is the cost difference between virtual and physical events? I'll give a brief answer to this. In that my view is that typically with scaling audiences, they're cheaper, mainly because of you want to work out a value per audience member. And so one of the beautiful things about the digital world is it scales really easily. So, hey, if we've got a venue booked for 500 people and 500 people show up, that's it, you're at capacity. If you have a virtual event planned for 500 people and then suddenly 2,000 people decide to join, it just involves scaling up more servers, which with modern cloud infrastructure is really easy to do. I don't know, Toby, Jess, whether you have any further points on that.
None for me. No, you had hit that one quite well.
Trying to talk, blend it so that I'm not just talking all the time, because some of these questions honestly, this is my life. How long is the ideal virtual event? Can it replace a full day event? I think ideal depends entirely on what you're trying to do. If you've got a longer term learning event that's planned, and you probably want to have multiple days, that's brilliant. And then we kind of have more, probably instead of, let's say, 3 full days, you might do 5 half days. The nice thing is that you don't have to factor in about all the logistics of delegates walking around. You can just kind of zip from one bit of content to the other. So things do compress. Obviously, the thing we have to manage is attention, and that if you're at a physical event, you're always thinking, well, it's going to be really obvious if I leave these seats now and just walk out of this plenary session. Whereas when we're dealing with people watching from their desktop, there are no such barriers. They can just leave whenever they want. So we have to ensure that we're building stuff that keeps them engaged all the time. I mean, Jess, can I ask your experience on the recent event, the virtual event, the Rio one? You were obviously very in the mindset of people moving around a venue, whereas the one we were on was quite intense, shall we say?
Yeah, it was, and I think that is a really, really good point. And I think, as I said, I mentioned before, just making sure that any slot that you would have had people wandering around with delegate movement, it's just making sure that if you do have a digital twin, that we would really recommend kind of everybody moves forward with, is making sure that at those kind of critical stages, people are still engaged and you don't lose them. Yes, they need to go grab a cup of tea, they need to go to the loo, they need to get something to eat, but just making sure they come back again, I think that's what's really critical.
And there's a really good question that just came in on extending that content out about rerunning. And so one of the things we've talked to some of our clients about is the idea of a broadcast as live. So you do your live event day one, you know that you won't hit all of your audience. This is particularly important when you've got audiences at different time zones. And hey, you've had the content generated and you're really happy with it, but you want to kind of repeat that live hit, that live high as much as possible. And so you can rebroadcast that content. You can take the content set that you've generated on day one and rebroadcast it and kind of extend it out. Now, the main thing we have to remember here is that obviously the content doesn't change as per the audience engagement. You can still have the questions open for people to submit data, but it's not going to move and kind of move about as much as a live event should. So it comes with compromises, but it can be done. Toby, one for you. I'm really going to throw you on it now. Is how do you feel about partnering with other event agencies?
Well, it's not something we've done it. We've done it before. I think this is the time for the event industry to work together and pull together here. There is room for all of us to be doing excellent work, as there has in the past. what I'd like to say is, and I can feel the pain of some event industries that are in experiential areas where they really need people there. Work with agencies like us, because we might have really useful and engaging ways of dealing with a remote audience that you haven't necessarily thought about. I'm more than happy to talk to anybody at any time about that. This is moving forward as an industry, and it's not just one company trying to steal a march here. We must work together.
Very good answer. Sorry, really losing my voice now. Must keep the energy high. Something that a lot of people have asked about, I think I've seen about 4 or 5 questions, is, hey, a lot of us are staring at lockdown right now, and we're worried about actually getting cameras to people to record them. So how on earth can we run a virtual event? I will say that this event that we're running right now is a good example of that. I'm in Sandbach, that's near Crewe in the north of England, and Toby and Jess are in the London area at the moment, and we're not sending massive camera crews. We have good cameras and good audio equipment, but this is actually being bridged all digitally without masses of equipment. So that, to me, will be the future in the short term, because it will be increasingly difficult to get camera crews to places. Now, what that means is that we have to ensure that speakers have good enough webcams and good enough audio equipment. Now, this is where the advent of things like home streaming, Twitch streaming, the prosumer market is coming to our rescue, because what it's forced a lot of tech providers to do is develop AV equipment that's quite cheap, that is very high quality. And so for some speakers, we're sending them webcams, we're sending them microphones. For others, we're working with what they already have. And so it is tricky. You have to bear it in mind, but it absolutely can be done. And it links to a question we asked earlier: is, hey, we're in a situation now with a lot of people who can have kids at home. The home internet might be absolutely hammered. How are we going to guarantee the bandwidth? Well, there's 2 answers to that. Is it has to work both ways. So you have to do testing with those people in advance to make sure that they have the bandwidth of the baseline to support it. Then you have to have a system that's flexible enough to get different qualities when it needs it. So the broadcast you're watching right now, you can watch it on the lowest quality, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend, but you still get to hear us. And although the video is pixelated, it still works. And that flips on the other side to the actual bridging speakers in. So the connection we're running right now, I'm connected to Jess and Toby. They're running through my computer here, which is on a home internet connection. And there's been a few points where if the bandwidth has dipped, all it's done is sacrifice a little bit of quality. Now, I'm hoping that you haven't noticed that, but it's just all the work that's happening in the back end to make that happen. So there are technical challenges. They're often presented as very hard things to overcome. They're not. They just have to be kind of given considerations from a logistics point of view. Jess, I'll throw this one to you. What do you think is the hardest thing about running a virtual event?
Ooh, probably mind frames. As I mentioned, I was guilty of that. I was skeptical. I had to see it in action to really believe it. So I'd say kind of changing people's perceptions, whether that's clients, whether that's delegates, and as I mentioned as well, the whole making sure everybody feels comfortable in the environment. I think that's really, really critical.
Yeah, it's the idea of you're kind of asked to sit at a desk and watch this content, and if you're not actually engaging with it, you're just watching it, and it's then very tempting to open Outlook or something else. Toby, any advice for ticket pricing for a physical event which has been moved to a virtual one?
That's a good question. This is clearly for events that are funded, and we're working with a client at the moment who has an event in January next year where there are ticket sales. There are also sponsors and exhibitors, that all of whom pay to make this event cost neutral, and we're actually communicating the digital twin up front and center. So as soon as the site goes live, a digital twin aspect will be there. So delegates who are going to sign up and pay money will have a number of options where they can see that if things are mitigated by circumstances out of our control, they actually get more content and they get more engagement than if they went to the actual physical event. exhibitors and sponsors exactly the same. If you want people to give you, upwards of 15,000-20,000 pounds to be a headline sponsor, that is where you need to have a very good digital twin. I can't express that enough. If you don't start doing that now, no one is going to take you seriously at your event, and you will not get the revenue you need to run it.
Thank you. I appreciate we're running a little bit over now, and the volume of questions is such that I think it does need to be given its full due. So I'll probably end up recording something a little bit after this, and we'll send it as part of it, because some of these questions really are fantastic. Thank you so much, everyone, for submitting them. Toby, I will throw back to you just for the final question. Jess, I'm sorry, it's very rude of me. I'm not ignoring you.
No, not at all.
Is do you think this we'll all stop talking about this in 2021?
No, we won't. We're in this situation for the long term. I'm considering the next year at least, and these are events that we have in 2021, advising clients that they must start action now. Don't wait. Do not wait to see if what happens and this might work or that. No. This is here for the long run. 1 year minimum. We need to be considering this in advance, and then onwards from there.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to everyone that has watched. I guess we've swapped host roles here, Jess, and I'm closing us off. But I hope that's okay. I'm gonna get told off after this. So first,
No,
Jess,
go for it.
Jessica, thank you for sharing your time and doing this with us, and exactly the same to you, Toby. Thank you so much. More importantly, thank you to everyone. Thank you for getting engaged. Thank you for submitting these questions that are so good. I can't wait to record some answers for them. But I think that's it for us. There will be follow-ups. The conversation does not end here. If this has been interesting to you and you have things that you want to discuss right now, get in touch. We can give you some more personalized advice, because that's quite important. For now, though, I'll say goodbye. I'll offer you kind of an elbow bump, and we're going to keep good social distancing and hygiene. But we'll speak soon, everyone. Thank you so much, and goodbye.
Thank you.